Oh, okay. This is a very important point. The canon laws and the rules of the church always have sided on the integrity of marriage without establishing or even holding to the idea that, well, this marriage may not be valid, so therefore we're going to treat it as invalid until we get through the investigation and then get to a ruling, which seems to be the way things are run now. But traditionally, the church has always sided on the validity of the marriage, waiting for evidence or proof to show that the marriage was never existed, that it was nullified or should be nullified because it didn't exist before that. So the establishment of canon law and the way the canons work, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is also on the side of the marriage, but it's being used against spouses in the proceedings, the way that it's set up currently, the procedures. Why don't you walk us through that a little bit? Because I think that a lot of people don't really understand how this works.
Okay. And to help explain it, a distinction needs to be made between the practice and the actual law or doctrine and tradition or jurisprudence going back for centuries. Because the practice right now is, if anyone feels that she's a disgruntled spouse, and here's rumors about annulments are out there, and that person thinks, I'm bored of my husband, I want out, she could go to a priest, and the priest could say, in perfect innocence, trusting the system, the priest could say, and I've heard people complain to me that this is what their experience was. My wife, I'm talking to the husband, the wife is told by a priest, well, you might have an invalid marriage. So you can have that checked out. It sounds like you might have an invalid marriage. And the kind of things the wife's complaining about are boredom. I don't like him anymore. I don't have that romantic feeling. He's a pain in the neck. We don't have the connection. I don't have the community of life and love. It's all this soft stuff. So that's the practice. But and then, well, how do I learn about an annulment? Oh, Father. And it's like, well, you got to get your divorce first. You get your civil divorce, and then the church will look at the validity of your marriage. So that woman walks out of talking to the priest, kind of feeling like, well, maybe the reason my marriage is no fun is because I'm actually not married. That's the practice. They require a civil divorce before they'll even look at the validity of the marriage, at least in the United States.
Yeah, let's stop right there, because when we look at the idea of divorce, Scripture is very clear. For the Lord hates divorce. That's a direct line from Scripture. And you start considering the idea of a divorce. A civil divorce has no merit or standing within a canonical court, or at least it shouldn't, because a civil divorce would be a civil declaration that has no bearing on the spiritual actuality of a situation. So the idea that a couple should be seeking a civil divorce before pursuing an annulment seems backwards.
Oh, it's way worse than that. And even what you said there is what we hear a lot. A couple pursues a divorce. Most divorces are unilateral divorces, one spouse against the other in a low conflict situation where there's not abuse and not adultery. So you've got one spouse pursuing the divorce, which you said earlier that there's no defense for the defendant. And then what the government courts do is they have no respect for the permanence of marriage. And they have no sense of the obligations of spouses to provide mutual help for maintaining one household. It's actually the opposite. So children are forced now, instead of having two parents working together to maintain one household, even if a mom and dad are annoyed with each other, there's a ton of benefits for stability and security and resources when you've got two adults in one household. But instead, the divorce splits it to two adults in two households. And then, people think, at least I used to think this until I started learning about no-fault divorce. I thought when you went to the civil court, you would get justice. And I had a notion from my Catholic upbringing, justice is where you give somebody their due. So the civil court's job is to give somebody their due. But in no-fault divorce, it's the opposite. So the husband who wants to keep his family together, who's done no adultery, no abuse, he's left facing the government taking away his children and taking away his property. And if the wife wants to live with those kids, she's going to be able to live with those kids almost always. It's what I see. So the husband's going to be paying for his kids to live in a house where he's not allowed to live. So and for the Catholic Church to require this is upside down, backwards.
Well, upside down, backwards, and wholly unjust, because what they're doing now is they are introducing a destabilizing scenario that will further degrade the marriage. So instead of allowing for any healing or even ordering, hey, look, you two need to treat this as if you're married and we need to work things out and we'll get to the bottom of it. They really, the introduction of the civil court to try and determine the efficacy or the solidity of a marriage prior to an annulment sounds not just backwards, not just upside down, but highly injurious